On a bitterly cold winter night, a man living alone in a remote cabin hears a desperate sound outside, scratching at the door, followed by a soft growl. But what he finds when he opens it will change everything. What would you do if a wild animal begged for your help in the middle of a blizzard? Would you risk your life to save it, or shut the door and walk away? When a massive bear stumbles into his cabin, weak and shivering, the man is faced with an impossible choice. But as the night unfolds, he learns that survival doesn't always follow the rules. And sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places. Will he survive the night, or will he pay the price for his decision? Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The wind shrieked through the frozen wilderness, rattling the wooden cabin like an angry spirit. Snow, thick and relentless, smothered everything in sight, piling against the walls, creeping over the roof, erasing the world outside. The fire inside crackled, its feeble glow barely pushing back the heavy darkness pressing against the windows. The man sat hunched in his chair, hands wrapped around a tin mug of cooling coffee. His breath curled in the icy air, vanishing before it could rise too high. He had lived alone in this remote corner of the world for years, and he knew the sounds of the forest well. The eerie groan of bending pines, the distant snap of frozen branches, the muffled howls of wolves too far away to be a concern. But this was different. A faint scratching, slow, hesitant. His fingers froze around the mug. The sound came again, this time accompanied by something else, a low, guttural noise. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. His heart pounded, sending a burst of warmth through his otherwise frozen veins. No one came out this far. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, the road to civilization buried beneath feet of ice and snow. Even experienced hunters wouldn't risk a journey in weather like this. Whatever was outside wasn't human. He placed the mug down slowly, listening. Scratch, scratch. Another low sound, almost like pleading. His pulse pounded in his ears as he rose from the chair, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He grabbed the old hunting rifle propped against the wall, his fingers tightening around the worn wood. It wasn't the first time he'd had to deal with wild animals sniffing around his cabin. A starving wolf, a desperate fox, sometimes even a bear, though never in a storm like this. He moved toward the door, his breath steady, controlled. The floor creaked beneath his weight, the sound nearly swallowed by the howling wind. Carefully, he leaned toward the frost-covered window, rubbing a patch of glass clear with his sleeve. And then he saw it. A bear. Not just any bear, a massive beast, its thick coat weighed down by sheets of ice, its body hunched, trembling. Its dark eyes, normally fierce and untamed, were dull, heavy-lidded with exhaustion. The man's grip tightened on the rifle. He had seen bears before, big ones, dangerous ones, but never one like this, never one begging. It stood just beyond the threshold, its massive paws sinking into the snow. It didn't move to attack, didn't snarl, didn't even lift its head fully. It just stood there shaking. The man swallowed hard. This wasn't normal. Bears didn't come to humans for help. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Let nature take its course. It wasn't his problem. A wild animal was still a wild animal, no matter how pitiful it looked. But then, the bear let out a sound, a low, broken whimper. His breath hitched. Bears didn't whimper. His heart pounded against his ribs, the rifle suddenly feeling heavier in his grip. This wasn't just a hungry animal looking for food. This was something else. Something wrong. He hesitated. If he opened the door, he could be signing his own death warrant. A single swipe of those claws could rip through flesh like paper. But if he didn't, the bear took a step forward, then stumbled. That was it. The man's fingers moved before his mind could stop them. He reached out, turned the lock, and cracked the door open. A blast of icy wind rushed inside, snatching his breath away. The bear flinched but didn't attack. It collapsed. The massive creature crumpled onto the wooden porch, its heavy body shuddering violently. The man staggered back, his pulse racing. For a long, frozen moment he stared. Then he moved. The gun clattered to the floor as he lunged forward, gripping the bear's thick fur. It was stiff with ice, colder than it should be. He dug his boots into the snow, muscles burning as he dragged the half-conscious beast inside. The moment the bear crossed the threshold, it let out a deep, rattling breath and went completely still. The door slammed shut behind him. For a few seconds, the man just stood there panting, staring at the giant creature sprawled across his wooden floor. The fire's flickering glow cast strange shadows over its motionless form. He was inside his house. A bear. What had he just done? His hands shook, but not from the cold. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. Up close, he could see the extent of the damage. Ice clung to its thick fur like jagged armor. Blood crusted one of its massive front legs, a deep gash running along the muscle. Its ribs showed. It wasn't just cold, it was starving, wounded, dying. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. This thing should be dead. And yet, here it was. He moved carefully, grabbing an old, tattered blanket from the couch and draping it over the bear's enormous body. It barely covered half of it, but it was something. Then he did something even crazier. He got water. He got food. And, against every survival instinct, every shred of logic, he started saving the bear. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, something far more terrifying was beginning, because the man had no idea what he had just let into his home. And by the time he found out, it would already be too late. The cabin's walls groaned against the wind as the storm outside intensified, howling like a living thing. Inside, the man stood frozen, his breath coming in uneven gasps, his fingers still gripping the doorknob. The massive bear lay sprawled across his wooden floor, its thick fur caked with ice, its massive chest rising and falling in uneven, shuddering breaths. The weight of his decision settled over him like the cold itself. He had let a bear, a wild animal, into his home, his sanctuary, and now, it lay there, weak, vulnerable, but still dangerous. The rifle was just a few feet away, leaning against the wall where he had dropped it. Instinct screamed at him to grab it, to keep it close. But something stopped him, something he couldn't quite name. Slowly, cautiously, he moved forward. The firelight flickered, casting shadows over the bear's massive frame. Up close, he could see the full extent of its condition. Its fur was stiff with frost, but worse than that, there was blood. A deep gash ran along the bear's front leg, the dark, clotted wound barely visible beneath the thick layers of fur. The injury looked old, yet not old enough to have fully healed. The bear had been suffering for days, maybe even weeks. The realization made his stomach twist. How long had it been wandering like this? How far had it traveled before collapsing at his door? More importantly, why him? A bear should never have come this close to a human, let alone willingly enter the cabin. And yet, here it was. A strange mix of fear and fascination gripped him as he crouched lower, studying the creature. It was still breathing, though its inhales were deep and labored, like every breath took effort. For a moment he hesitated, debating his next move. He could push it back outside, let nature take its course. But he knew deep down that wasn't an option. If he put it back out there, it wouldn't survive the night. His fingers flexed involuntarily. He had never done anything like this before, never tried to help something so wild, so unpredictable. But he also knew that no animal, no matter how strong, would have chosen to enter a human's home unless it was desperate. And this bear, it was beyond desperate. He let out a slow breath and made a decision. Grabbing an old, tattered blanket from the couch, he carefully draped it over the bear's back. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. The fur beneath the ice was colder than it should have been, so cold it sent a chill up his own spine. Hypothermia? Was that even possible for a creature this size? It didn't matter. What mattered was keeping it alive. He stood, moving with quiet urgency. The cabin wasn't stocked for emergencies like this. His supplies were meant for one person, not a half-ton predator. But he had water, he had food, and more than anything, he had time. The storm outside made sure of that. He grabbed an old metal bowl, filling it with water from the large jug near the sink. Carefully, he placed it near the bear's head, then hesitated. Would it even drink? For a long moment, nothing happened. The bear didn't move. Then a low, rattling breath, a slight shift, and then a flicker of movement. The bear's eyes cracked open. The man's pulse spiked. He took an instinctive step back, muscles coiling. This was a moment, the moment where everything could go wrong. The bear's dark eyes, half-lidded and unfocused, met his. For a brief, impossible moment, something passed between them. Then, the bear slowly, weakly, lowered its muzzle toward the bowl. The metal clinked softly as it nudged the water's surface. Then a sip. The man exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He didn't know why, but that tiny movement felt like something huge. The bear wasn't fighting him. It was trusting him. He watched, barely blinking, as the animal drank in slow, struggling gulps. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove one thing. It wanted to live, and that was all the reason he needed. With renewed determination, he turned toward the small stash of food near the fireplace. There wasn't much he could offer a bear. No fresh meat, no fish. But he had bread, a few scraps of dried venison. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed a piece of venison and hesitated. Was he really about to do this? Cautiously, he stepped closer, extending the food just within reach. The bear's nose twitched. It sniffed once, twice. Then, slowly, it lifted its massive head and took the offering straight from his hand. A sharp rush of adrenaline surged through him, but he didn't move, didn't even breathe. The bear chewed slowly, weakly. And the man, he realized, with a strange, unsettling certainty, that something had just changed. Not just for the bear, for him, because in that moment, in the flickering firelight, he no longer saw it as just a bear. He saw it as something more, a survivor, a fighter, something that had come to him, against all odds, seeking help. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The realization hit him harder than he expected, sending a lump to his throat. For so many years, he had lived out here, isolated from the world. By choice, by necessity, he had convinced himself that he needed nothing and no one, that solitude was better, that it was safer. But now there was this strange, fragile connection between a man and a bear, between two creatures who, by all logic, should have been enemies. And yet, somehow, in this moment, they weren't. They were something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. And as the bear let out a slow, deep exhale, its heavy head resting against the floor, the man found himself sitting back down, his own exhaustion creeping in. The storm outside raged on, but inside, for the first time in a long, long time, the man wasn't afraid, and neither was the bear. The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows against the log walls. The bear lay motionless, its massive form stretched across the wooden floor, its fur damp and matted from melting ice. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting. Wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin as if demanding to be let in. The man exhaled slowly, still crouched near the bear, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was madness. He had let a wounded, starving bear into his home. It had already accepted his water. taken food from his hand, but that didn't mean it was safe. At any moment, it could wake up fully, and then what? Would it see him as a savior or prey? The rifle was within reach, but he hadn't touched it since pulling the bear inside. If he was going to do this, he had to commit. Carefully, he moved toward the storage chest by the wall, fingers working fast. He had some medical supplies, alcohol, bandages, and old sewing kit. He had never used them on anything bigger than a cut on his own arm. A bear? This was an entirely different challenge. Still, he couldn't ignore the wound. Kneeling beside the beast, he hesitated. The wound ran along its front leg, just below the shoulder. Thick fur hid the worst of it, but as he parted the hair, his breath caught. The gash was deep, ragged. It wasn't fresh, but it also hadn't fully closed. A claw mark? A bite? Whatever had done this was big. Another bear, maybe? The thought unsettled him. He reached for the bottle of alcohol, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate motion. This was going to hurt. He could only hope the bear was too weak to react. Holding his breath, he poured the liquid onto the wound. The bear's body jerked. A deep, pained grunt rumbled from its throat, and the man froze. His fingers tightened around the bottle. His entire body went rigid. The bear didn't rise, didn't snap its jaws, didn't even lift its head. It just shuddered, a long, slow tremor that passed through its enormous frame. Then it stilled again. The man let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Working as fast as he dared, he cleaned the wound, then pressed a cloth over it, applying pressure. Blood seeped into the fabric, but not as much as he feared. The bleeding was slow, a good sign. Next came the bandages. He wrapped them around the wound with careful, steady hands, layering them just tight enough to hold. As he worked, he kept glancing at the bear's face, watching for any sign of resistance. But something strange happened. The bear didn't resist. It let him work. And for the first time, the man noticed something in its posture. Not fear, not aggression, trust. The realization sent an unexpected wave of emotion through him. He had seen wild animals before. He had watched them hunt, fight, die. But never had he been this close, this deeply involved in the survival of something so powerful. And the strangest part, the bear knew it. It understood on some instinctive level that he was helping. The moment the last bandage was secured, exhaustion hit him like a weight. His muscles ached. His fingers were stiff from the cold. He leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand down his face. Outside, the storm continued its assault. The wind roared, shaking the cabin, but inside there was silence. The bear's breathing had steadied. It was still weak, but stronger than before. The man stared at it for a long moment, then sighed. He reached for the firewood beside the hearth, tossing another log into the flames. Warmth filled the small space, flickering against the walls, pushing back the cold. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten much himself, but he knew the bear needed more food. This time he didn't hesitate. He grabbed another piece of dried venison, moving slowly as he placed it near the bear's mouth. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the bear's nose twitched. It let out a slow exhale before opening its eyes. Just a little. Its dark gaze met his, and for the first time, there was clarity behind him. A quiet, watchful intelligence. The bear didn't lunge, didn't growl. Instead, it took the food from his hand. A deep shiver ran down the man's spine. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't act like this. But tonight, nothing was normal. The bear chewed slowly, then rested its massive head against the floor again, its eyes still on him. A strange feeling settled in the man's chest. He wasn't just helping the bear. He was bonding with it. And that scared him more than anything else. Because if this creature didn't make it through the night, it wouldn't just be another loss to the wild. It would be personal. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting long shadows along the walls. The man hadn't slept, but exhaustion gnawed at his edges. The bear had barely moved, save for the occasional slow, deep breath. Every so often, its ears twitched, reacting to the sounds of the storm outside. The man sat in his chair, watching, thinking, how had it come to this? How had a life of solitude led to this moment? Where he sat in a cabin with a half-dead bear, fighting to keep it alive. He had never been good at letting people in. And now, a bear had done it instead. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Almost. Another gust of wind battered the walls. The storm wasn't letting up. He was trapped here, stuck with a creature that could still kill him the second it regained its strength. But for some reason, he wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was saving something. And whether the bear knew it or not, it was saving him too. The night stretched on. The fire burned. And as exhaustion finally pulled at his mind, the man closed his eyes, not in fear, but in acceptance. Because whatever happened next, one thing was certain. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was the bear. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dim cabin. The man sat slumped in his chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't slept, but he had dozed, just for a moment, just long enough for the weight of the past hours to settle into his bones. The bear, still lying near the fire, had barely moved. Its breathing had grown steadier, deeper. The wound, though still raw, had stopped bleeding. For the first time since this insane night began, the man allowed himself to think, maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. And then, a sound, low, deep, a growl. His eyes snapped open. The bear was awake, but it wasn't looking at him. Its ears were pricked forward, its muscles tense, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled deeply. The man's gut clenched. Something was wrong. Then he heard it, a distant rustling outside. At first, it was nearly drowned out by the howling wind. But the more he listened, the clearer it became. Something, multiple somethings, were moving just beyond the cabin. The bear's growl deepened, a sound like a low, guttural warning. The man's pulse spiked. Slowly, heart pounding, he reached for his rifle, gripping it tightly as he rose to his feet. He moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Then he saw them, eyes, glowing, watching, a pack of wolves. 5, no, 6. They hovered at the tree line, dark figures shifting between the storm-blown branches. Their fur was dusted with snow, their bodies lean, hungry. The man felt a chill crawl up his spine, not from the cold, but from the understanding. These weren't just passing wolves. They had been following the bear, tracking it, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, they had found him, too. The bear let out another growl, this time louder. The wolves didn't retreat. They held their ground, watching, calculating. The man's grip on the rifle tightened. This was bad, really bad. A bear was dangerous, but a pack of wolves? That was a coordinated attack. One wolf, he could shoot. 2, maybe fight off. But 6? He wouldn't stand a chance. His mind raced. Could he scare them off? Fire a warning shot? Stay inside and hope they left? Then the bear moved. For the first time since collapsing in the cabin, it rose. Not weakly, not struggling. It stood, and when it did, it didn't look injured. It didn't look like an animal on the brink of death. It looked like a force of nature. The wolves tensed. A few took cautious steps forward, testing. And that's when the bear did something the man never expected. It stepped in front of him, protecting him. The man's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an instinctual response. This wasn't just animal aggression. The bear was defending him. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. A deep, rumbling snarl filled the cabin as the bear bared its teeth, stepping closer to the door. The wolves hesitated, but only for a moment. Then they lunged. The standoff. The first wolf struck fast, breaking into a sprint across the snow, teeth bared. The bear reacted instantly. A massive roar split through the night, louder, deeper than anything the man had ever heard. The cabin shook. The sound was pure power, a warning that couldn't be ignored. The lead wolf skidded to a halt. Another tried to flank from the side, but the bear was faster. With surprising strength, it swiped its massive paw through the air, sending a spray of snow and ice flying. The second wolf barely dodged in time, letting out a sharp yelp as it stumbled backward. For a moment, everything froze. The wolves reevaluated. They had been tracking an injured bear, a dying bear. But this bear? This bear wasn't weak anymore. The man barely breathed. He kept the rifle raised, his eyes flicking between the animals, waiting for the inevitable next move. The wind howled. The bear stood its ground. And then, one by one, the wolves stepped back. Not running, not panicked, but retreating. Slowly, cautiously, they turned and faded into the darkness, disappearing into the storm. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath. The man didn't lower the rifle until the last shadow vanished into the trees. Then silence. The only sound left was the wind outside and the ragged breath in his own lungs. His heart still pounded. His hands still shook. But the bear? The bear simply stood there, staring after the wolves. Then it turned. For the first time since the attack, it looked at him. Not like prey, not like an enemy, but like something else entirely. Something almost human. The man swallowed hard, his throat dry. There was no logic to what had just happened. This bear had no reason to protect him. And yet, it had, not just by instinct, not just by accident, it had chosen to. The weight of that realization settled in his chest like a stone. He had saved the bear, and in return, the bear had saved him. He let out a slow breath, lowering the rifle completely. The bear exhaled too, its shoulders relaxing slightly. The tension between them had shifted. Not predator and man, not enemies. Something else, something deeper. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was something new, a bond, a connection forged in survival. The man knew, without understanding why, that his life would never be the same, because after tonight, he was no longer just a man in the wild. And the bear? The bear was no longer just a beast. They had become something more, something that neither of them could have ever expected. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. The wolves, once determined, relentless in their hunt, had realized something. They had underestimated the bear's strength. The bear that had been weak, vulnerable, had now proven itself to be a force to be reckoned with. The man stood in stunned silence, his rifle still in his hands but no longer aimed. His heart pounded, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but something inside him had shifted. The wolves were retreating, slowly, one by one. The pack backed away, slipping into the shadows, their glowing eyes fading into the snow-covered landscape. The man didn't move. He didn't dare. The last wolf turned, giving one final glance at the bear. Its amber eyes met the bear's, and for just a heartbeat, it seemed as though an understanding passed between them. Then, with a low snarl, it vanished into the night, the rest of the pack following suit. The wind howled again, but the danger had passed. The bear stood perfectly still, watching the retreating wolves for a long moment. Then, with a deep, rumbling exhale, it turned back toward the man. The man could hardly believe what had just transpired. He had been saved, but not by his own doing. The bear, despite all logic, had chosen to protect him. It had chosen to save his life. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. He had expected to fight, to defend himself. But instead, he had been given the rarest of gifts, the gift of survival, given by the very creature he had been trying to save. The bear's eyes met his once more, calm, steady, and oddly knowing. For a long moment, the two of them simply stood there, the warmth of the fire between them, their lives forever intertwined by what had just happened. Then, without a sound, the bear turned and began to walk toward the door. The man's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. The bear paused at the door, its massive form casting a shadow on the floor. It turned its head just slightly, as if looking at the man one last time. Then, with a final, almost grateful glance, it stepped into the snow. The door creaked as it swung open, the cold night air rushing in. The bear's massive silhouette blended into the storm, disappearing into the wild, leaving the man standing in the cabin alone. The man didn't move for a long time. His mind reeled. His body was still shaking from the night's events. But now, there was a strange peace settling over him. He had known solitude. He had known survival. But he had never known this. The bond he had forged with the bear was like nothing he could have ever imagined. It was unspoken, built on trust, on something more than just the will to survive. It was something deeper. And now, that bond was broken. The bear was gone. But somehow, the man knew it would never be forgotten. The silence in the cabin felt different now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. It was full of something more. Something that couldn't be defined, couldn't be put into words. But it was there. The man stepped to the window, gazing out into the swirling snow, his heart still racing but with a sense of finality. The storm would end. The wild would remain wild. But he had been changed. The bear had given him more than just its protection that night. It had given him a glimpse into something he hadn't realized he was missing, a connection. He looked at the spot where the bear had disappeared into the snow, and for a moment, he felt something stir deep within him. Gratitude, wonder, and yes, loss. Because he knew, as the hours passed, that this was the last time he would ever see that bear. He had been given a rare gift, a fleeting moment of grace in a world that often felt unforgiving. And so, with a deep breath, the man finally spoke, quietly, to no one but himself. That night, I didn't just save a bear. I made a friend I'd never see again.